Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be tackling a question that's both ancient and cutting edge. Is reality an illusion?
Yeah.
And don't worry,
Right.
we're not talking conspiracy theories here. We're going to be talking about how our brains actually create
Yeah.
the world we experience.
Yeah.
We've got some really fascinating source material for this deep dive.
Yeah.
A panel discussion of the World Science Festival,
Great panel.
plus articles from Philosophy Now and Psychology Today.
Very cool.
Get ready to kind of question everything you thought you knew about what's real.
It's going to be a fascinating journey because most of the time we just assume our senses are
Right.
giving us a direct feed from the world. But as we'll see, it's more like our brains are building a virtual reality based on the information they receive.
So let's dive right into this idea that our senses don't actually show us reality, quote
Yeah, right.
unquote. Dr. Lotto from the World Science Festival
Yes.
made this point really clear. I
Yes.
thought saying our brains evolved to help us survive, not necessarily to show us
Right.
some objective truth.
And what's interesting is it seems like our brains have become really good at predicting what we're going to experience based on what we've encountered before. Dr. Constantinople called this Bayesian inference.
So is that like my brain is saying, okay, last time I saw a striped thing in the grass, it was a snake.
Yes.
So this striped thing is probably also a snake.
Exactly. It's a shortcut that helps us react quickly to potential dangers.
Right.
But it also means we're not always seeing things as they truly are. Our brains are filling in the gaps with their best guesses.
Which makes sense evolutionarily speaking, but it's also kind of freaky.
Right.
When you think about
It
it.
is. And we even have a real-world example of this from the World Science Festival.
Oh, yeah.
Remember the taste test with the miracle berry?
Oh, yeah. That was wild. People were drinking vinegar
Yes.
and saying it tasted like lemonade. So their senses were sending the signal for sour. But their brains, tricked by the miracle berry, interpreted it as sweet.
It's a great illustration of how much power our brain has in shaping our experience.
Right.
And it ties into something we read in psychology today.
Okay.
Nature itself doesn't have inherent qualities like color, smell, or sound. Those things only exist because our senses provide the content.
Hold on. So you're saying a rose doesn't actually smell like anything?
Yeah.
Unless I'm there to smell it?
That's a great way to put it.
Like my senses are painting the world, but the canvas is blank.
Your brain is actively creating those sensory experiences
Wow.
based on the information it's receiving. It's
Okay.
not just a passive receiver.
My mind is officially blown.
Good.
So if our senses are building this reality, what happens when the construction gets messed up?
Yeah.
Enter illusions.
And this is where things get really interesting. Dr. Seth from the World Science Festival
You okay?
actually argued that illusions aren't errors,
Okay.
but features. They show us the cracks in the matrix, revealing how our brain is constantly building and updating its model of reality.
So like those optical illusions where the lines look different lengths even though they're the same?
Yes.
That's not my eyes messing up.
Right.
It's my brain trying to make sense of the visual information.
Precisely. And it's not just vision.
Okay.
Dr. Lombardis, also from the festival, said that even smell is an illusion.
Interesting.
Scents are just chemicals. It's our brain that assigns them, meaning based on our experiences and culture.
So like how some people love the smell of durian fruit and others think it smells like stinky socks.
Exactly.
It's the same chemical,
Same chemical.
but different brains
different brains.
interpret it in drastically different ways.
It all comes back to how our brains are interpreting the sensory data.
Yeah.
And Psychology Today had this cool little experiment to
Well.
demonstrate this. If you cross your fingers and touch your nose,
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
it feels like you have two
It
noses.
feels so weird.
It's because your brain usually gets different signals from the two sides of your fingers.
Right.
But when you touch them to the same spot, it creates a conflict.
Right.
And your brain decides the most likely explanation is that you have two noses.
So even my sense of my own body is a construct open to interpretation. That's kind of unsettling.
It is. And speaking of unsettling,
Yeah.
there's also the phenomenon of phantom limbs, where people who have lost a limb can still feel sensations in it, even
Yeah.
pain.
So their brain is still holding on to that model of the body, even though the physical limb is gone.
Yeah.
It really highlights how much of our reality is a mental construct, not necessarily
Literally.
a direct reflection of what's out there.
Right. Which brings us to this fascinating question. If it's all a construct,
Yeah.
how much control do we actually have over it?
That's where things start to get really philosophical.
Exactly.
Uh,
And Dr. Hoffman from the World Science Festival offered this intriguing analogy. He said that our shared reality is like a computer interface. We all see the same desktop
Okay.
because we have the same interface shaped by evolution.
So we humans are basically running the same mental software, which
Yeah.
lets us communicate and understand each other.
Right.
But it also suggests there could be other interfaces,
Yes.
other ways of perceiving reality that we're totally blind to.
Right.
Like, imagine if there were other species out there with
Yeah.
senses we can't even comprehend.
Totally.
Their reality would be completely different from ours.
Wild.
Whoa. So we might be missing out on entire dimensions of experience.
Yeah.
Simply because our brains aren't wired to perceive them.
Right.
That's a mind-blowing thought.
It is. And speaking of mind-blowing thoughts,
Okay.
philosophy now explored a whole bunch of perspectives on how we know what we know, and some of them get pretty wild.
Yeah, they had everything from solipsism, the idea that maybe only I exist,
Right.
to the Zhuangzi butterfly dream,
Oh, yeah.
where you can't tell if you're a man dreaming you're a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming you're a man,
Classic.
to the idea that we're all living in a simulation like in the Matrix.
Yep. It's a great reminder that our understanding of reality is always limited by our perspective.
For sure.
And they also raise this important distinction between the world as it might be in itself, which philosophers call the noumenon,
Right.
and the world as we experience it called the phenomenon.
So even if there is some objective reality out there, we can only ever access it through the filter of our senses
Right.
and our brain's interpretation.
Right. It's like we're always looking at reality through a tinted window.
Yeah.
And Psychology Today had this really interesting example of this with the color pink.
Wait, what's so special about pink?
Well, it turns out pink doesn't actually exist as a wavelength of light.
Hmm.
It's a color our brain creates when we see red and violet light together.
So pink is like a mental fabrication. My whole life is a lie.
Not quite. It's more like your brain is doing some creative interpretation to create a color that doesn't exist
Wow.
in the spectrum of light.
That's wild. And it makes you wonder, are there other things out there that we're completely missing
Yeah.
because our senses just aren't equipped to detect them?
Yeah.
What if there are entire realities that we're blind to because our interface isn't programmed to see them?
That's a fascinating question, and
Yeah.
one we'll definitely explore further.
Okay.
Because if our reality is a construct,
Yeah.
then what's to say we can't change the way we construct it?
Right.
Could we actually reprogram our brains to perceive the world in entirely new ways?
That's a question I've been dying to ask. Could we actually reprogram our brains
Right.
to perceive the world in entirely new ways? It sounds like something straight out of science fiction.
It does, doesn't it? But there are already hints that our perception of reality isn't as fixed as we might think.
Oh. Like what?
Well, think about sensory substitution devices. These tools allow people who have lost one sense to experience the world through another sense. For example, some devices convert visual information into sound patterns, allowing blind people to see through their ears.
That's incredible. So their brains are essentially learning to interpret sound
Yeah.
in a completely new way
Right.
as visual data.
Exactly. And then there's research on neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change and adapt
Okay.
throughout life. Studies have shown that even adults can learn to perceive things differently through training and practice.
So it's not just about our brains filling in the gaps with predictions.
No.
They can actually learn to process information in fundamentally different ways.
It seems so.
Huh?
Which makes you wonder what the limits of perception really are.
Right.
Could we train our brains to sense things we currently can't, like magnetic fields or radio waves?
No, that would be a truly mind-bending expansion of reality. But let's bring it back to those illusions we talked about earlier.
Yes.
Those seem more like tricks than actual changes in perception.
Right. True. But even illusions can be revealing.
Okay.
They demonstrate that our perception is malleable and can be manipulated by external stimuli.
So if we can be fooled into seeing things that aren't there,
Yeah.
could we also be trained to see things that are there,
Yeah.
but we currently can't perceive?
That's the big question. Imagine if we could develop technologies that directly stimulate specific areas of the brain,
Okay.
creating entirely new sensory experiences.
Okay, now we're talking Matrix levels.
Right.
But seriously, what would those new realities even be like? Could we experience things beyond our current senses?
Yeah.
Like Maybe seeing the world in infrared or ultraviolet.
It's hard to say for sure,
Right.
but the possibilities are fascinating to consider.
Yeah.
We could potentially expand our sensory horizons far beyond what we currently think is possible.
But wouldn't that also raise some big questions about what's real and what's not? If we can manipulate our perception of reality so easily, how do we know what to trust?
That's a crucial point.
Right.
If reality is a construct,
Yep.
then who gets to decide what's real? How do we ensure that these new technologies are used responsibly?
Those are heavy philosophical questions. And it makes me think about the idea from philosophy. Now that there's a difference between the world as it might be in itself
Right.
and the world as we experience it.
The noumenon versus the phenomenon.
Right.
It suggests that even if there is some objective reality out there, our access to it is always filtered through our senses and our brain's interpretation.
So even with these amazing technologies, we'd still be limited by the way our brains are wired.
It seems likely. But perhaps that's part of the beauty of it all.
Okay.
The exploration of reality is an ongoing journey, a process of continually refining and expanding our understanding of the world and our place in it.
I love that perspective. It's not about finding some ultimate truth,
Right.
but about embracing the mystery and the possibility of endless discovery.
Exactly. And this journey doesn't have to be purely scientific either. Many ancient wisdom traditions have explored these ideas for centuries.
Oh, you mean like meditation and mindfulness practices?
Exactly. These practices focus on cultivating awareness of our thoughts and perceptions, helping us see the world with fresh eyes.
Right.
And question our assumptions about reality.
So it's not just about adding new senses.
Right.
It's also about deepening our understanding of
Yeah.
the senses we already have.
Precisely. By becoming more aware of how our minds create our experience of the world, we can gain more control over that process.
So it's not about escaping the illusion, but about becoming more conscious creators of our own reality.
Beautifully put. And that brings us to another fascinating concept from psychology today.
Okay.
The distinction between sensation and perception.
Okay, remind me what that was all about.
Sensation is the physiological response of our senses to stimuli,
Okay.
like light hitting our eyes or sound waves vibrating our eardrums.
Right.
But perception is our conscious experience of those sensations, how our brains interpret those signals and create meaning from them.
So it's like my eyes might be picking up on certain wavelengths of light,
Right.
but it's my brain that says, aha, that's a beautiful sunset, or, oh, that's a stop sign.
Exactly. And this distinction highlights how much of our reality is created in the mind.
Right.
It's not just about what's out there,
Right.
but also about how our brains are processing and interpreting that information.
And if our brains are the ones calling the shots, then maybe we have more power to shape our reality
Potentially.
than we realize.
Right.
And if our brains are the ones calling the shots, then maybe we have more power to shape our reality than we
Right.
realize.
Potentially. Yeah.
It's amazing to think that even something as basic as color perception
Right.
is so subjective, so dependent
Totally.
on our brain's interpretation.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what other aspects of reality
Yeah.
we're taking for granted, assuming they're objective, when they might actually be products of our own minds.
That's the exciting part. It's like we've been given this key to unlock a whole new level of understanding about the world and ourselves.
Right.
If we can become more conscious of how our brains construct reality,
Right.
then perhaps we can become more active participants in that process.
Okay, I'm all in on this idea of conscious creation, but how do we actually do it? How do we shift our perception, reprogram our brains, and experience reality in a new way?
Well, there are many paths one could take.
Right.
Some might find it through mindfulness practices,
Okay.
learning to quiet the mind and observe their thoughts and sensations without judgment.
Uh-huh.
Others might find it through art or creative expression,
Okay.
using imagination and intuition to explore different ways of seeing the world.
I love that idea of using creativity as a tool to reshape our reality.
Yeah.
It's like we're not just looking at the painting, but picking up the brush and adding our own strokes.
Exactly. And remember, it's not always about dramatic transformations or seeing things that aren't there.
Right.
Sometimes it's about subtle shifts in perspective, noticing the beauty in the everyday, or appreciating the interconnectedness of all things.
So it's not about trying to force our will on reality,
Right.
but about cultivating a sense of openness and curiosity, allowing ourselves to be surprised and delighted by the world around us.
Beautifully put. It's about embracing the mystery and recognizing that our understanding of reality is always evolving.
This whole conversation has been such an incredible journey,
It has.
and I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
Indeed. And that's the beauty of it. It's an ongoing exploration, a lifelong invitation to question, to learn, and to expand our understanding of ourselves and the universe we inhabit.
So for everyone listening, here's a final thought to take with you.
Okay.
If our reality is a construct, even if just partially,
Right.
and we have at least some potential to shape it,
Yeah.
what kind of reality do you want to create? What kind of world do you want to see?
Let that question be your guide. And remember, the power to shape your experience lies within you.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep creating your own reality.
Yeah. And if our brains are the ones calling the shots, then maybe we have more power to shape our reality than we realized. Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this whole conversation so empowering.
Right?
If we can change the way we see the world, we can change the world we see.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, change your thoughts and you change your world.
Exactly. It's not just some feel-good mantra. It's backed by science. We know our brains are constantly adapting and rewiring themselves based on our experiences.
So it's not about escaping the illusion.
Right.
It's about becoming
Yeah.
more conscious creators of our own reality.
Beautifully put. And that brings us back to that question we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
If our reality is a construct, at least in part, how much control do we actually have over it?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like we have more potential than we might think.
We do, but it's not about some kind of magical mind control where we can just wish things into existence.
Right.
It's about understanding the principles of perception, how our brains work, and using that knowledge to create more positive and fulfilling experiences.
So it's about working with our brains, not against them.
Exactly. And that takes effort and practice. Just like we train our bodies at the gym, we can train our minds to perceive the world in new ways.
So what are some practical steps people can take? I mean, you mentioned mindfulness earlier.
Yeah, mindfulness is a great place to start. It's about paying attention to the present moment without judgment, noticing our thoughts, feelings, and sensations as they arise.
So it's about becoming more aware of that filter that our brain is using to interpret reality.
Right. And once we're aware of it, we can start to question it, challenge our assumptions, and choose more empowering perspectives.
I like that. So it's about becoming more conscious of the stories we're telling ourselves about the world.
Yes. And remember, the stories we tell ourselves shape our reality. If we tell ourselves negative stories, we're going to experience a more negative reality. But if we tell ourselves positive stories, we're going to experience a more positive reality.
That makes sense. So it's not about ignoring the bad stuff or pretending everything is perfect.
Right.
It's about choosing to focus on the good and using that focus to create a more positive experience.
Exactly. And that's not to say it's easy. Our brains are wired to focus on the negative, to scan for threats and dangers.
Yeah, it's that whole survival instinct thing, right?
Exactly. But we can retrain our brains to focus on the positive, to look for opportunities and beauty in the world around us.
It's like we're rewiring our brains for happiness instead of fear.
That's a great way to put it. And the more we practice this, the easier it becomes. Our brains are incredibly plastic. They can change and adapt throughout our lives.
That's encouraging to hear. So it's not like we're stuck with whatever reality our brains have created up to this point.
Not at all. We have the power to change our perception, to expand our awareness, and to create a more fulfilling experience of reality.
This has been such a mind-expanding conversation. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too. It's always fascinating to explore these big questions about the nature of reality and our place in it.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we're not just passive observers of reality. We're active participants in creating it.
Exactly. And that's both a huge responsibility and an incredible opportunity.
So for everyone listening out there, I encourage you to take this conversation as a starting point. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep creating the reality you want to experience.
And remember, the power to shape your reality lies within you.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep creating your own reality.